I want to thank the organizers of the conference. Thanks for getting me out of the United States right now. I have a lot of existential anxiety right now. So my talk today, I'm a psychiatrist. I work in California and in New Orleans. So my talk today probably is a warning from the United States. We oftentimes there talk about the school to prison pipeline. Over my 30 years of work, I've come to realize that there's also a healthcare to prison pipeline when we misdiagnose our children. So, can someone tell me how to get this to work? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about developmental trauma and how, when it's misdiagnosed in children, they oftentimes end up with the inappropriate care and end up many times in the prisons. And I just want to quote Felitti, the architect of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, who said that traumatic events of the earliest years of infancy and childhood are not lost, but like a child's footprint in wet cement, are often preserved lifelong. I carry with me the voices of children in the prisons, usually black children, usually black males, who, because we misdiagnosed them early, they ended up with their dysregulated brains in juvenile carceral systems. I have 3 case studies, and this morning you heard about pegabytes, where it's like 500,000. You have to drop down to three kids I'm going to share with you. And oftentimes, these were kids. I'm not going to go into all of the information, but these are kids who grew up with caregivers who, for their own traumas, could not provide them with the kind of care and love. And for some of the kids for whom I worked in New Orleans, this was worsened by a huge natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina. So oftentimes these were kids born to mothers and fathers with mental health and substance use disorders. I feel a bit weird, and I think this creates a little bit of anxiety for me in the African context, talking about early attachment, because you really gave the Western world what it means to be really attached to your children. So excuse me when I talk about malattachment, because oftentimes, pre-colonial, what you taught us was the divinity of children who came from the divine to be with us, to bring messages. And there was also a construct of a divine mother. That being as it is, given I stand here as a child of the diaspora with colonization all through 300 years of our existence, many of us lost that. Another very helpful African lesson is that children are born helpless, and it's the love and care from loving homes and villages that children learn the world. We create our minds from the outside in. And again, I feel strange in Africa talking about this, and maybe I'm warning you not to adopt some of those westernized principles that have separated us from our children. And we're here, as some of our speakers were talking about not having enough child and adolescent psychiatrists in certain countries. I went, sometimes we've not been doing the right things that we need to do for our children. So I just want to remind us that we're biologically wired, mother and child, with oxytocin to attach. We know that it's the mother during childbirth passes high levels of oxytocin, as the child also, their own cells begin to develop the capacity to produce oxytocin. Because the child is going to have to signal to the mother, please give up your own narcissistic needs so that you can care for me. And we used to do that very well, because we oftentimes, in older indigenous systems, carried our children on our backs. Someone told me in Zimbabwe, I don't understand you Westerners. You push your children away in strollers. Us African women, we hold them close. So this is about remembering and not adopting some of our bad principles. Winnicott, with many of the kids that I see in prisons, what I learn is, and again I think Winnicott learned some of this from us, that the good enough mother never retaliates. So the infant learns, I have been survived. And if you have been able to survive me with all my aggressive impulses, I'll be okay. The world will also be there for me. Just want to remind us of Bowlby, who talked about the infant being biologically wired to seek closeness through the way they suck, they cling, they follow, they cry, they smile. The first attachment work comes from the infant to the mother or any other caregiver. And I know there are complex family structures, and I don't want to get into that here, but it's not only biologic mother who cares and gives to a child. I want to remind us that Mary Ainsworth actually went to Uganda and was maybe in awe of what she saw. And so when she went back, she did this strange situation study where we talk about the different kinds of malattachments. Mail and Solomon took it to a higher level of disorganized attachment, and that is when, and these are the kids that I see, that the caregiver was so unpredictable, so frightening, that the kid grew up being so confused about attachment, nurturance, and love. We know that we're not going to get out of this lifetime without some level of trauma. And just because the word has become so commodified, to remind us that trauma is when we experience a psychological wound, one in which we felt threatened, that there was a sense that we could die. For the children I'm speaking to, and maybe they're the children here, there's war, there's conflict. In the US, structural racism and poverty creates a lot of havoc in the lives of children. And so what is usually normal for us, having tolerable stress that teaches us how to just get beyond and build resilience, or positive stress that teaches us, again, that life, as is said in Buddhism, life is going to present us suffering. How do we manage it? Those are the levels of stress that if children have buffers, they will be okay. And they will learn, they will build their resilience, and they will achieve that which was their gift to this human life experience. But for some kids, that's not what happens for them. And we see a lot of that in situations where there's a lot of poverty in the US, issues of racism. Perhaps that's not so much here, but there are levels of social and economic strife and poverty in kids, and there's war, and increasingly more climate issues. And so when kids early on do not get the buffer, their neurobiology becomes dysregulated. And I'm sure many of you know that. I just quickly will go through this. Is the hippocampus, where we manage memory. It becomes dysregulated. Lot of either flashbacks or lack of memory. The prefrontal cortex, that, as you know, is that which helps us with our executive functioning around preparing, reasoning, being flexible, being reflective and reflexive. It becomes dysregulated. And for many of the kids that we see, and this is where I think as healthcare practitioners we get into trouble, it's the hypersensitized amygdala that's responsible for making us feel fear or lack of fear. And when there is extreme levels of toxic stress, when there are no buffers in the home, there are no buffers in the communities in which kids grow up, in villages, and for us in conditions of real structural racism, it comes down through our structures, the laws, our schools, education. Then in those situations of continued toxic stress exposure, then kids, their amygdala becomes dysregulated. So when we're saying to young people, think before you act, biologically that's not what's happening. They're reacting to prevent the next bad thing from happening. And so their actions are impulsive, they're hasty, and it's after it happens, like when I see the kids in the prisons and they say, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Because they weren't thinking. Their brains were dysregulated and the amygdala overtook their prefrontal cortex. Also, with the dysregulation, some of the neurotransmitters and hormones become impaired. So oxytocin, that we call the love hormone, it becomes impaired in these kids. And they don't have the levels of serotonin that are needed to help to regulate mood. We do know that scientifically, but we're not applying it to certain children. So one of the first forms of extreme trauma that kids can experience is attachment relational trauma. Those first 3 years of life, when it's so important to feel a mother's heartbeat. And this woman in Zimbabwe told me, that's why we can potty train without the struggles, because when the kids are attached to us, we feel their little GI systems irritable, and we put them on the potty. I can't tell you the amount of kids that we see where the struggle in potty training was so difficult. So if the child doesn't have the nurturance, the love, the caregivers who say, I can survive you. For me as a resident, having my kids coming home after being on call, my baby's crying, I had to find the energy to get up and go get them. If they don't have those nurturing, loving experiences, and if it's continuous and frightening, as Maine and Solomon said, then they experience attachment traumas in those first 3 years. One judge referred to it as attachment infanticide, because as you listen and hear of the kids who end up coming into court, usually this is where it began. We know about the ACEs study. I quoted a little bit of Felita's work, where if in the first 18 years of a child's life, they experience abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, emotional or physical neglect, or with the kids that I'm talking about, where in addition to that, there were household challenges with caregivers who had mental illness or substance use, or there were huge separations that in the US can happen because of the high rates of incarceration in certain communities, or with divorce. And because, again, of the unique situation there are certain states that decided those are not the only things that can traumatize children. So in Philadelphia, they added some of the community and structural factors. So if there's violence, if they grow up with violence, if they experience racism or discrimination, if their neighborhoods are unsafe, if they grew up in foster care. And in California, the first Surgeon General, who was an African-American woman, Nadine Burks Harris, oversaw the group that also added, if before the age of 18 you grew up with food insecurity or housing instability, it is likely to impact the development of your brain. And so if you've had 1 to 3 of these experiences, you're beginning to develop the eventual what can become mental health disorders. So you are likely to engage in using substances or engagement in unsafe sex. If you developed more, if you experience more than 4, you're more likely then to begin to show some of the signs of this earlier engagement in risky behaviors, so substance use, and the substance use can begin to increase cardiovascular diseases. And if you had more than 6 ACEs, when compared to kids who had maybe 1 or none, you're more likely to die 20 years earlier. And just a caveat, I once gave this talk, and at the end of it, one of the students came up to me and said, "Am I going to die because I had more than 6 ACEs?" I reassured her, no, one can be treated, one can with the proper care. And the proper care is where, as healthcare providers, we get into trouble. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Because when we diagnose children with conduct disorders or attention deficit disorders, we perhaps have not paid attention to their brain dysregulation. 1 minute? Okay. All right. So let me just say that the cases I presented, they were all misdiagnosed. And I call them, they had the lazy diagnosis. ADHD and conduct disorders are lazy diagnosis because if you spend the time with the kids, oftentimes they experience severe traumas, toxic stress in their early lives. And so I want to encourage us to think about going beyond those disorders to consider what we're hoping will be in the DSM-6, which is developmental trauma disorders that accounts for all the brain dysregulation that results in the symptoms that get misdiagnosed either as ADHD, conduct disorders, or depression. Even PTSD is not good enough because this was based on adults and adult traumas. So I'll just leave with what I know, and this is some of what I've heard. Policy and practice has to adopt a healing justice framework where we really acknowledge the impact of trauma on the brain, and then we engage in the kinds of treatments, which oftentimes for kids, it's talking therapy, or it's arts-based therapies. It's bringing them back in nature, encouraging their creativity. Sleep. We now know how important sleep is. So I've been bombed. I thank you all. I don't want to insult anyone with the practices that we know emanated from this continent about how to raise loving children. So thank you very much. Do not adopt our behavior.